Thank you, Max. How's the sound check back there, Jerry? Okay, very good. Thank you all for coming this evening. About a little more than a year ago, Jean Hull conned me into being the judge for last year. And she forgot to mention that as punishment for doing it, that I had to give a follow-up presentation this year. So that's why I'm here. So this is my punishment. Thank you for joining us. I thought we would go through and try to provide some interesting information for you. Max, the down arrow, oh yes. Okay, so there's lots of information available on the web about contests and contest secrets. The National Association, or sorry, the North American Nature Photography Association, known as NANPA, has a wonderful little brochure or booklet available on the web. It was free. And it has some lovely examples. And if you go to www.nanpa.org, you should be able to find this. And it's a very, very helpful thing. Tonight, the next few slides, there's a lot of information. Please don't worry if you don't catch it. All of this will be on the web for you. Tomorrow, the whole presentation, by all means, photograph what you wish. So this is a very useful place to get to look. Also, F3C has a wonderful website, and it's a great reference place. You will note that the F3C has about 5 categories: color, creative, documentary, interpretive, and mono. And that doesn't mean necessarily black and white, it means mono. And they have all of their photographs from the different competitions put up there. But if you go to this website and go to the radio buttons up here and pick the contest and then ask it to sort by score, you get a very interesting listing. You'll get all of the winners by first, second, and third. And it's a great place to look and see what are judges awarding and what's winning, what's giving people interest. And by the way, F3C uses a system where they score out of 20. So very, very rarely will you see something higher than 17. So this gives you a good idea, and it's a really wonderful place to see how. Sorry? Jim Brady, yes, you'll see several people here. I see Derek was on here. Ted, yeah. So you'll see a number. So now we're down into the other. But this is a really wonderful website, and it's best if you do the sort by score. And then, so otherwise it's rather tedious. I originally did it without sorting this way, but this will give you a great idea. So generally it is agreed that photographs are evaluated on 3 main areas. The overall impact, which is kind of the wow factor, composition and elements, and then the technical aspects. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on these in a moment. F3C does an interesting job, but frankly there are too many words here in this for the moment. If we go to another slightly different way to look at it here, this is a criteria from the web, but it talks about the impact, the storytelling, the creativity under group 1, and the technical area that are looking for technical excellence. That means sharpness, exposure, processing. Is it focused? Is there color balance? And how about the lighting? And then in composition, they suggest 3 areas in terms of the composition. Is there a center of interest? And what's the subject matter? Again, don't worry if you don't get this, it'll be on the website. One of the questions that you might ask is the title of the entry useful? I could take a good photograph, will it not speak for itself? And the answer is no bad photo will win because of a great title. But yes, a good title does help. I'd like you to look at this example. Why? A good title tells the judge the story that you want to convey in that photo. Because sometimes it's not obvious what your intent was or what you really saw. But a good title surely tells that. And that's exemplified in this next photograph. This is quite an interesting photograph. Was one of the winners in last year's. And looking at it, you could spend quite a bit of time wondering what's going on in this photograph. But once you look at the title, which says, "The Eyes of the Homeless," boy, that really gets you to focus in on what the photographer saw and the story that they were trying to tell. So this is a wonderful example of the power of adding an appropriate title. I thought it might be helpful for you to quickly go down through the results that we had in each category last year. This won't take very long. I'm not going to talk too much. This is Derek Chofe's wonderful shot of the little climbers. I think this is a radio tower, TV tower in Budapest, Derek? Prague, thank you, Prague. An amazing photograph. Second was Glenn Shook with the Late Night Kiss. And third was this very, very interesting photo. It's very tough to look at that photo for too long once you've read the title. In the area of creative, we had some wonderful shots. Patricia had this Power of Now with a very, very interesting zoom. Jean Hull had this rather artistic interpretation of the sunset after the fire. And there was this amazing shot by Tim Davis, which is called The Art Critics. And I still haven't really figured out how he did this, but it was very, very interesting. How about the documentary results? Jerry Veal had this wonderful shot, looks like the Daytona motorcycle races. Second place was Tim Davis with this wonderful catch, and something completely different was Cindy Merrill. And the next was the area of the results, of the nature results. Now, earlier on, I mentioned how the importance of color is in the photograph and how it can have a big impact in how judges look at color. But I want you to look at the winning photograph here in the nature area. It's by Max, and it has almost no color. But it is an amazing photograph because this is the moment of life and death. It's life for the crocodile, it's death for the poor wildebeest. And the fact that it doesn't have the color doesn't really matter. It's such a powerful story, it tells itself. I'm very familiar with this situation because I know this was shot on the banks of a river in Tanzania, between Tanzania and Kenya. It's the famous Mara River crossing. I stood on that bank for 3 days trying to get this photograph about 4 years ago, and the crocodiles were all lazy, fat, and happy, sitting in the sun. They never attacked any wildebeest. I was terribly disappointed. So when I saw this, it was a wonderful, wonderful shot. And I know Linda had some other great shots in this area. So here's a photograph with quite a bit of contrast. This got second place. Look at the color in this, quite dynamic. And the third, quite an amazing photograph by Linda. There is only a small dab of color, but that color tells the story of the shot. And on the people results, we had some interesting, this was again Derek, this was from Jack Grieder, and it's entitled Ordering Lunch. And I'm not sure if you can really see it, but there is a lady in a yellow dress sitting on the steps. Rather hard to see. I'm not sure if the people on Zoom can see it, but the title is Ordering Lunch. She's on her cell phone. And this is a wonderful shot by Liz. And I just love the way the guitar takes up that empty space up there in the top left corner. So I reckon I've told you really everything that you need to know about what judges need to know. And if you're in agreement, we could kind of finish now and go to the bar earlier. I see Max is giving me the thumbs down. So actually, fortunately, I have a few other slides that I have, so maybe we won't do that. But one of the things I wanted to point out to you is that not all categories are created equal. What do I mean by that? Well, last year we had 35 entries in the general category. So just statistically, if you entered in that area, you had a 1 in 3 chance to win. In nature, there were only 23. You had a 5% chance by just putting into that. In people, 22 entries. You had a 5% chance to win in that category. And if you went into the creative, there were only 16 entries. You had a 6% chance by just going in. So by putting stuff in the general category, you're up against some pretty good photos. And as you will see in a little while, it was a very crowded category, and some great photos didn't win simply because there weren't enough places. So one of the things I want you to think about this time is, what is the most appropriate category for my... And it's not always obvious. And not all categories are created equal. So be sure you choose the best category for your photo, because just throwing it in general might not be, but also choose the appropriate category. Now you're probably asking, well, what does that mean, the appropriate category? And to explain that, I'm going to share with you a rather embarrassing story I had earlier on this year. My wife Jerry and I went to Cuba and we went to a photo fest down in Cuba, and it was very interesting. The Cubans wanted us to photograph a whole bunch of things in birds in particular. And they then wanted everybody to submit photos in 3 categories: birds in flight, local birds, and then general. So in the birds in flight, I shot this rather nice, rare black hawk. It did well, but it didn't actually win the category. I overprocessed a bit in my laptop. I couldn't see it, but the judges pointed out that, and I thought their comments were quite fair. In the endemic birds, I submitted this photograph. This is called the Zapata wren, and it's a very rare wren, and the Cubans just go crazy over this little bird. They're very hard to find, and so this was one I'm singing. The problem was that all the other photographers had a photograph like that as well. So, and then it was late at night, they wanted 3 photos. I threw this photograph in to the endemic birds simply because there were too many of them that were the same. Now, normally I wouldn't submit a photograph like this because it has a couple of things wrong. The first is that the wings are a bit blurry. And the second is there's this terrible, ugly stick going down the right-hand side. And I only threw it in to put something in different. So at the end of the competition, one of the judges came up to me privately and said, "Senor Trainor, I have good news and bad news for you." I said, "Oh, really? So tell me, what was the good news?" And he said, "Your photograph, it won the birds in flight competition." I said, "Really? But you gave out the prizes of 1, 2, 3, and I didn't get any." And he said, "Yes, senor, that was the bad news. The bad news was this was the thing, but you entered it into the wrong category and you were disqualified. He said, we never get photographs of this little bird flying, and your photograph was judged to be the winner. That's this one, not particularly good photograph. So you never know what judges are looking for and what the other competition is. So be prepared to do something a little less obvious. And the other moral of that story is, in the end, the judges are always right. So be sure to pick the right category for your photograph and the appropriate category. The obvious of throwing it into the general isn't necessarily the best category. Okay, I want to spend a few minutes just talking about categories and rules, because neither are categories are equal or rules are equal. I want you to see in the light teal on the left-hand side that F3C has different categories than the beaches photography. And there are about 7 or 8 categories. They have some, we have some different. I want now also for you to look at the yellow line here across. I've put allowed adjustments. And adjustments come in 2 kinds. There are global adjustments and local adjustments. Global adjustments are things like changing the overall exposure, improving the saturation, all those kinds of things. And local adjustments are where we highlight a particular feature and we may make those things, we may sharpen them, maybe we even clone them out. And you will notice that the rules, as they were last year, are really quite different. And in fact, it turns out that in the Beaches Club, we actually did a wonderful job of describing what photos were actually allowed into a category. But we did a terrible job of actually telling photographers whether you were allowed to make specific adjustments or not. And it caused quite a bit of confusion. Now, the wonderful thing is that Liz and Dave and Max and the Rules Committee have completely revamped the rules, and this year it's much clearer, the new set of rules, of what is allowed and what isn't allowed. So thank you, Max, and it was Leslie, I'm sorry, Leslie. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about really the 5 features of a great image. And in general, if we look at our images in these 5 categories, and instead of all the detailed stuff that we did earlier on, we'll end up with some pretty good images. And I thought that if we concentrate on these things and some examples, you'll find that we have some of the obvious things to look for. At the time I was putting this talk together, I had just come back from Borneo. So I was processing my photos from Borneo at the time. And so I've used a number of those to show you where problems arose and what I did to fix them. And I thought it might be interesting for you because we all take photos that don't quite come out from the camera correct. And you'd find it much more interesting about how can we work with what we get and how can we make them better. I might add at the beginning, some of the things I'm going to show you will be allowed by some of those rules and some of those categories, and some of them won't. But in the end, we're mostly photographing and improving our pictures for our own pleasure. And that's the important thing in this area. So let's look at the first one, which is an interesting and focused subject. So the first question a judge will ask is, what is the subject of this photo and why did they take this photo? Now here is a very interesting photo. It's a very famous place north of Jackson Hole and south of Yellowstone, and it's called Oxbow Bend. And there we have the Grand Tetons. It's a wonderful bend in the river, and if you go up there in September, October, you will get these wonderful colors. The problem with this particular photo is that if you look at the foreground, it's not in focus. If you look at the middle ground, the trees, they're not in focus. The water isn't in focus, and neither of the... Now, I'm sure the photographer who took this probably took 5 shots of this, and the other 4 were perfectly in focus and looked great. And my guess is that when they went to submit for the competition, they pulled this one without looking too detailed at it. And sadly, it was probably the one photograph in that sequence where it wasn't actually in focus. So before submitting, please zoom in on your photo and check that the photo for sharpness, because I'm pretty sure that this particular photo was added by accident, and had any of those other ones in that sequence been, it would have been perfect. So accidents can happen. The second most important thing to remember for judges looking for interesting and focused subject is that in dealing with people and animals, the eyes have it. So when we see an intimate photograph, this is an orangutan, a grandmother orangutan in Borneo, the first thing your eye does is goes to the eye of that subject. And if those eyes aren't sharp, forget about it. The viewer and the judge will lose interest. That's where the eye goes first. After that, the eye goes beyond that. So here's a wonderful photograph that was submitted last year. It's a very difficult shot to take because this is a spoonbill and it has a very long bill, and it's very easy to focus on the bill. And since this was taken with the telephoto lens, it turns out, and it's not so obvious here, but the eyes are very slightly out of focus. And that's because they're further back than the bill. The camera focused on the bill. And when I modified the photograph, last year I tightened up the eyes, so to speak, and now those eyes are perfectly in focus. You notice that I did some cleanup on the palms, but now this photograph is in perfect focus. And this is a problem that you'll see again and again about dealing with depth of field when we focus, particularly with big lens. So here's another very interesting photograph taken probably of a tiger at the zoo. It's wonderful, except that the right eye is in focus, and believe it or not, the left eye is not. And this can happen with a large telephoto lens if the animal turns its head very slightly. You'll get this effect. How do we fix it? Well, I simply went in and cloned the right eye, flipped it around, and put it on the left eye, and who would know? Right? Now, you might think this is a very rare phenomenon, but I ran into this problem a couple of years ago with a wonderful shot that was taken by Sean Argus and submitted to the Jacksonville Club. And this wonderful tiger shot, the right eye is in focus and the left eye isn't. You can't quite tell on the screen, and it's just the adjustment of the head. What is really quite amazing, by the way, I checked, it's not the same tiger. I checked the stripes to see in case maybe he had a bad eye, but no. And so what's going on here? Well, it turns out that many people in the club are shooting with pretty long lenses, and to get these tigers, you often have to shoot through wire. And if you're using a big lens like a 600 millimeter, the depth of field of a 600 millimeter wide open at f4 at 20 feet is only 1 inch. This means that between the tip of the nose and the eye, one can be in focus and the other can be out of focus. So how do we solve that problem? So when I'm presented with a situation like this, I routinely focus on one eye, I take the photograph, try not to move the camera, and then using the joystick, the toggle, put the focus point on the other eye, and sometimes I will do it on the bridge of the nose. And you can do this very quickly, bam, bam, bam. And then you come home, you've got 3 shots. Sometimes 2 of them are out of focus. And so this is a very, very common problem. And a 600 millimeter lens, you may say, well, I don't have one. But many of you are shooting with 100, 500 Canon zooms these days and other big, these are big lenses. So be aware the depth of field can be very small and it shows up in the eyes. So this was also a lovely shot last year by Jim Askins. This photograph should have won. However, when zoomed in, it turns out the face on this lady was rather soft and the eye was out of focus. And this is what it is zoomed in. And it's a very easy fix. And last year, you just simply go into Photoshop, you take a brush, make a black brush, make a little circle and go over her eye. You cannot, maybe difficult to see, but there's a black spot in her eye on the right. We perceive that to be the eye is in focus, and that solves the problem. I met Jim a couple of months ago, and he mentioned to me, I pointed this out to him last year, he said he actually fixed the photograph and that it won or got a high place in some other competition that he was in. And I fully understand. It was a wonderful, wonderful shot, just suffered from this. Now you're probably saying, are judges not being too picky by zooming in to a photo? How many of you were thinking that, by the way? And the answer is no. The chances are a judge may have 4 or 5 great photos, and they're trying to pick which one of those is the best. And the only way to do that is to find fault or find some technical difficulty with some of those photographs. And so judges will zoom in on your photo, and if parts of it are out, they will do a detailed inspection of the photo. Because we have so many great photos, you have to look for something to find fault with. So maybe a bit unfair, but this is what happens because we're all up against some pretty good competition in this area. Along this lines of depth of field, which I spoke about a moment ago, I want to share with you this photograph, which I took, by the way, with standing beside Jean Hull in Namibia last year. And these were 2 young lions. They were about 40 feet away, and they were in this gorgeous yellow grass. And I wanted to get them both in focus. The easy way would have been to put the lens or the camera at f/16, and I would have gotten them both in focus easily. If I had done that, all that lovely blurred background, we would see sharp grass, and it would be disruptive. So I shot it at f4. But this is not what I got. What I got was this. This is the first shot. The guy on the left is in focus. The guy in the back is not in focus. And I knew that because he's about 2 feet away. So without moving the camera very much, I simply moved the focus joystick onto the other guy, and I got this shot. And you'll notice now that the first guy is out of focus. What to do? Well, if you simply take both of those photos into Photoshop and using this first photo here with the guy on the left on the top layer and the other photograph on the bottom layer, using something called masking, a layer mask, And I know people are afraid of Photoshop and masks, but all that this is simply one photograph stacked on another. You get a brush and you click the mask button, and as you start brushing, you peel away the top layer and you see what's underneath. The word masking is a terrible word because you're not masking, you're unmasking. And that's one of the things that people get. So all I did was to get these two guys in. I put the top layer, I had the left guy in focus, the bottom layer had this guy in focus, and all I did was pulled away, and so now we have two perfectly mounted shots. Easy to do. This is a 5-minute exercise. If you're afraid of using masks, don't be. It's simple and it's very effective. So here's a shot in Borneo a couple of months ago. There were these plants with these beautiful red candles. I was up on a hill about 30 feet away from this lovely flower, and there was this gorgeous jungle foliage in the background. Just everything is blurred. And that was about 100 yards away. I knew I couldn't get those two in focus because they were about 6 inches apart. So I shot the first one, changed the focus, shot the second one, brought them into Photoshop, simply did a mask, and here we have the one on the left where they're both in perfect focus. And again, you might say, well, why didn't you go to f16? You'd have got them both. Yes, and then you would have seen ugly jungle in the background, whereas we have a lovely blurred background that doesn't detract from the subject that we're trying to make. And this, we'll see in a minute, this lovely blurred background is very important. Yes, Jerry?
Just a quick question. If the camera has focus stacking options in there, would you recommend using those?
Jerry, yes, that's a very good point. Nikon does a great job in the focus stacking, but not many of the Canon cameras have it, except the very new ones. And that's very good if you have a flower and you're doing this. But when you have a big lens like this, it's just easy to go bang, bang, and that's the quicker way. But yes, indeed, thank you for bringing that out. Focus stacking is another great way to do that. So this was just a casual walk and shoot. Okay, so, alrighty, so let's talk about the second interesting and important thing is placements of the subject in the frame. So this is a shot taken down at St. Augustine Alligator Farm of a lovely spoonbill. I had the camera vertically, and then he opened his wing, and the wing almost hit the top of the... I just had enough space, if you like. It's not cropped, that's exactly as I shot him. But do you notice how that wing is creating a tension in the photograph because it's right up against the edge? So we need to basically create more space around that edge. To do that, you simply bring it into Photoshop, and then using the cropping tool, which is highlighted on the left, you simply gently pull up and create this area up there, this white area, and extending the canvas. And then, as long as you have content-aware filled in there, and you hit go, Photoshop fills in the rest for you. Jerry Veal showed us some excellent examples of this a couple of months ago. And that area there is the area that's been filled in, and it's done it without leaving any residuals. Now, if you look, there's more room in the photograph. So if we do a little more work, we take the photograph, lighten it up a little bit, boost the saturation, and then if you use the dehaze slider, dehaze does an amazing thing. You see how on the wings on the right, you can almost see through the wings. And so now we have a photograph that has much less tension in it because there's space all around. And using this dehaze slider is really terrific for letting you see through the wings of the... Okay, this was a photograph from last year. I mentioned it had two problems. One, the guy looks like he's hitting his head on the thing. It causes tension. And even though there are waves, the horizon is crooked. See that? A simple fix, simply using what I did before, extending and then reorienting, makes this and makes it a much more interesting and a quick fix. No judge would ever know what you did there, if you know what I mean, and it now makes a perfect photo. So the next important thing is placement in the frame. The next aspect of placement in the frame, you don't always have to go with the rule of thirds. You can get away with a good subject if it's interesting and place them fairly close to the middle. This is a proboscis monkey, and this is a large male, and this is from Borneo. I want to talk about a frame within a frame. So we saw him simply by himself, but here is a situation where he's in the middle of a tree and his body is completely covered and we have leaves all around. And so now we have a frame within the frame, and our eyes go immediately to him here, and that's the focus of the subject. So you can do this frame within a frame in a number of ways, and I'll share this one. Here's an example of a long-tailed macaque. You see he's framed in this way. Wonderful short, long-tailed macaque, the baby. Again, it's the framing that does it. And this guy here is a young proboscis male monkey, the frame within the frame. This guy just looks like he should have a martini in one hand and a cigarette in the other, because he's just chilling out, being cool. So when we can try to find a frame within the frame, it really helps our photo. This is a shot from Jack Reeder that we showed earlier on, and you see there's this amazing frame here, framing the subject, which is the lady, and then the pyramid at the back. Now this was an HDR shot. How do I know that? Well, I know that you would never get the sky to be blue and be able to see the detail inside see the detail in here. So this was probably at +2, and this was certainly at -2, all stacked together, and you get this beautiful photograph, but it's the frame there that helped to tell the story we're peering into. So great job by Jack. So the other interesting thing is on framing is it's important if you're working with animals, particularly birds, is to leave some space for the subject to move into. Here's an example of a spoonie down in the alligator farm. You notice that the space on the left-hand side is open so that he can fly into it. I typically like to put the head no more than halfway through, and it gives this idea of motion. So this bird is clearly moving from left to right. No, sorry, right to left. And it's that empty space there on this side that is helping the motion of the bird and telling the story. Here's a rhinoceros hornbill coming in for a landing, and you can see, again, there's more space on the left. If you're very observant, you probably see that he was leaving a load on his way in. Now, if it were a competition, I probably would clone that out. But this is the natural history as it occurred at the time, and I've recorded it as such there. But the important thing is we can see the motion of the bird here, and again here, where there's more area for him to fly into. Let's look at one of last year's lovely shots. Great photograph of the Blue Angels. But this guy looks like he's about to bump into the left side, and it creates a tension in the photograph that's kind of crazy, but it's real. And simply using that technique that Jerry shared with us earlier on, and I showed you also, you just extend the canvas, and the aircraft have room to move in, and that takes away that tension that is seen there. Another important thing that drives judges crazy is uneven horizons or crooked horizons. Believe it or not, the human eye can detect 2 degrees of uneven horizon. And if you don't believe me, go to Photoshop sometime and just move the horizon, and you'll see that once you get to 2 degrees, you can detect that that horizon is funny. Now the horizon here is a bit funky, but you kind of notice that this crocodile seems to be swimming downhill. There is a gorgeous reflection between the canopy and the bank here against the river, but the camera was very slightly crooked, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Then we go in just simply, and it's particularly difficult in this case because of where does the river end and where does the bank begin. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And then there's the straightened horizon. And trust me, judges look for that all the time. Okay, so we've talked about interesting focus subjects, placement of the subject in the frame, and the next thing we're going to talk about is clean backgrounds and how important clean backgrounds are. Some of the photos that I've showed you earlier on were things we were working with depth of field. What I was struggling with was to preserve the clean background instead of just going to f16. So there is a Japanese word called bokeh, and that means clean background. And bokeh is in many ways caused by the number of leaf elements within the lens that you're using. So lenses that have f2.8 or 4 will have a much cleaner background, and the more leaf elements that there are in more expensive lenses, then the cleaner the background. And you'll often hear people referring to the wonderful bokeh that a picture has. It just means the background blur. The second thing to look for and be aware of is bright spots in your image, and to a lesser extent, dark spots. They're often called black holes, but it's the bright spots that will kill our images. So here's a shot from Borneo. The eye goes right to the flower, you look down the stalk, the eye goes to the background, there's nothing to see. The background is very clean. The eye then goes back and spends time looking at the beautiful flower. So that's a lovely clean background. Here's another lovely clean background. This is a flying squirrel. His pouch is here, he's got a lovely fur coat. And here is a monitor lizard. And again, you notice the very clean background. It was only when I was looking at these two yesterday, I thought, boy, I should just put those two photographs together. The trees look pretty similar, and that would be a pretty dynamic photograph. They look like they're on the same tree. Well, I haven't done it, but I bet we could make something interesting out of that. But those are two separate photographs. But what we're interested in here is main subject in focus and the clean background. Here's a shot of a blue-eared kingfisher. He's sitting in very difficult light. He's sitting on a branch, and the background just disappears. And he is the subject of. And here we have an orangutan just hanging out. The good news, he's a long way from the background here, and the background, your eye goes here, and then you can spend time looking at the animal itself and paying attention. So this was a rather interesting photograph. This was a very large crocodile who was coming down the river, and we were in a boat, and he was about 20 feet away, and I leaned over the boat with this big lens and just took a couple of shots because he was coming right at us.
Were you wearing a wetsuit?
I wasn't wearing a wetsuit. But the thing, first of all, is clearly I focused on the nose. And as you look at this photograph, the eye goes here, then the eye goes into this beautiful reflection. And amazingly, the eye then goes back here. You see, these are the big lumps. These are kind of leading lines going to the back. And the eye then goes back to this background.
Do you remember how far away you were and what your f-stop was?
I was about 20 feet away, and it was shot at f4. And thank you for asking that, because the one thing you notice is in this photograph, the eyes aren't sharp. But in this case, it doesn't matter, because there's the business end. That's where but you can see the eyes, and in fact, those eyes are about 2 feet behind, so that you'd need f22 with a big lens at 20 feet. Maybe you'd get them, maybe you wouldn't. But in this case, it doesn't really matter. I got away with it. It's a very powerful photograph because he's coming right at us, and it was just a grab shot. But the important thing here is getting good, clean backgrounds. So the next part of good, clean backgrounds is to look out for bright spots in your image. And if you remember the saying, the eye goes to the light. When you remember that saying, you'll start seeing photographs in a slightly different way. So here's a lovely shot last year. The flower here is nestling the next bulb go up. The problem is there are these ugly bright spots. So the eye first goes here, then your eye 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 goes back up. Once you see those bright spots, you can't unsee them. Now, simply using the clone tool, it's very easy to remove that. And look what happens. Now your eye goes here, and then starts to work its way around the photograph. So those bright spots can really kill a photograph. Here's one of a oriental pied hornbill taken in Borneo. He is up in the canopy, it's dark, he's a black bird. All you can do is give it +2 in the exposure compensation, and what happens? You get rewarded by this terrible bright jungle behind there. There's nothing you can do. You're either going to get detail on the bird, or you're not. So I shot him like this. So what do you do when you get a shot like that, where you have to increase the exposure and end up with such an ugly background? Well, this is the photo I ended up with, and you can see that the background is quite different here than it is here. How was that done? Well, there's 2 ways you can do it. The easy way is you can, if you're in Lightroom, you take the clone stamp tool, you find some green spots, and then start cloning them all over the bright spot. There's one here, here, here. So you can start cloning over those ugly bright spots and get rid of them. And that technique works very nicely, and it just takes 5 or 10 minutes, depending on the bright spots. It turns out, though, there's also now another really powerful technique in Lightroom, because Lightroom now has this masking capability. And you can ask Lightroom to select the subject. And look, Lightroom selected the subject perfectly, and it created a mask. But I don't want to lighten the bird, I want to darken the background. So you want to really select the background. So all I'm going to do is simply invert the selection, because we've selected the bird because it's the easiest thing to do. I tell it invert the selection, and here's the inversion. Now, anything I do in Lightroom will be done on this part. And if I take the slider, the exposure slider, and knock it down, say -1, I'm beginning to get rid of those ugly spots. So, point that I want to make is sometimes you end up with those very bright spots that ruin your picture. And without having to go into Photoshop, there are 2 easy methods that you can solve in Lightroom. So here's a lovely shot with a gorgeous clean background of a young male proboscis monkey. He was sitting under some shade, and that allowed me to get some really gorgeous detail on his fur, but the photograph didn't actually take quite like that. It turned out there was this ugly brown spot here, there's this white spot here, and this ugly black spot here, and your eye, once you started looking at him, the eye goes here, and then it goes here, and then it goes here, and now we're not looking at the subject anymore. So those simple things, and then if you take the clone stamp tool, in 2 seconds, boom, they're gone. And your eye spends time on the subject in question. Here's a lovely, it's called an intermediate egret. It looks like it's in the heron family. Don't ask me when a heron becomes an egret, I don't know. They call this an intermediate egret. He's sitting on a log, there's the river, but the photo as taken had these ugly bright spots. That was it before, this is after. This was as it was taken, and then you simply take the clone stamp tool. But once you see those bright spots, you can't unsee them. Your eye spends time there, and that's not where you want the viewer putting their shots. So we're back again to clean backgrounds. There's nothing, this is just a wonderful example of a beautiful bird called a black and red broadbill, and he sat on the stick for 5 minutes for us, and there was just a gorgeous, gorgeous background from the jungle behind him. We don't have to go very far to get good backgrounds. This shot was taken down in Cape Coral a few months ago and is of the burrowing owls, and he's sitting on his perch. But in the background, you'll notice ever so well out of focus were beautiful flowers. Instead of giving us a boring background, we've just got these gorgeous colored flowers, but they're all pleasantly out of focus, and your eye spends time on the bird in question. Here is a moss mantis. It's a praying mantis, and this thing is about the size of your little finger. And this was shot with 150mm macro lens at f/16 in the dark with a ring flash. Very difficult shot to get. But the nice thing is with a ring flash, everything goes black behind him, and we have a background that is clean, and we get to focus on the subject in question. This is a series I put together earlier on in the backyard this year of some bluebirds that were, or a bluebird pair that were in the nest. The original photograph, the original photograph basically comes to about there and consisted of this bird and this bird. This one wasn't in. So the idea then was to extend the background and to blur it. And then I probably took 50 or 60 shots of various ones approaching, and then dropped these guys in. But by having a nice blurred background, and it's still a bit bright in the background, which is nice, you notice how the bird just pops off the background, and we can pay attention to it. So by having clean backgrounds, it keeps the eye focused on what we're trying to do and where we're trying to keep the subject's attention. So this is kind of an interesting shot. This is a pair of rhinoceros hornbills. Very rare bird, very difficult to get, up in the canopy, and the background is the background. So you can be the judge as to whether this background works. Would you forgive it? Is it okay? Tough one to know. I show you that as an example because sometimes you just don't get to pick the background very well. So how do we get clean backgrounds? Well, you get clean backgrounds by shooting at the maximum aperture, which is probably f4, or maybe you have a f5.6 lens, open it up, and then be sure to work the subject, walk around the subject, find different perspectives. Sometimes you'll find a nice clean area that has a nice clean background, and when you have a good subject, it's really worth your while to work the subject and walk around. Now sometimes it doesn't matter how much you walk around, you end up with a terrible background. And this is a stork-billed kingfisher. He sat on this perch for us for about 3 minutes and he was gone. But you can see that there's not very much you can do with this background. It's kind of ugly, but it is a beautiful bird. Sometimes it is what it is. You probably wouldn't put this in a competition because the judge will say, that's a very ugly background. And they'd be right. And again, sometimes you can have a bird in a great position and the background is just terrible. Look what happens here. Your eye goes straight there. And after that, you start looking at all of these bright spots. And it's very difficult to get back onto the subject. What can you do about that? Well, for your own personal use, the one thing that you can do is if you go into Photoshop and just use subject select. Photoshop did a very good job of selecting out this subject. And I only had to make minor modifications to get this. And then if you simply create another white layer, just fill with white, and then drop him on the background, voila, this is what you get. Now I'll put it to you that many a judge would be in a tough position to know that that's what you did with that, when in fact this is where you were. And why do I mean about that? You may say the white is a bit fakey. Well, here's another shot taken against the sky, and because this is a black bird, you have to add +1.5 of exposure compensation. You lose the sky. The sky just gets blown out, but that's okay. They look almost very similar. So sometimes with ugly backgrounds, sometimes the best thing to do is get rid of the background. And with Photoshop these days in Lightroom, the AI technology they have will select, and with amazing capability, will select the subject or will select the sky for you. It's not like it was in the old days. Now I showed you this photograph earlier on, and this is the blue-cheeked kingfisher. And that wasn't quite the photo that I showed you. So this guy we were in a river, there was a canopy light all shaded, had to shoot at high ISO. I was using 1200 millimeters, so that's a 600 millimeter with a doubler. And even then I had to crop in to get this photograph. And because the light was so poor, it was shot at high ISO, there's two things that are obvious. The noise is terrible and he's not very sharp. But that isn't the photograph that I showed you earlier on. This is the photograph that I showed you earlier on. How did I do that? Well, there's a wonderful tool called Topaz Photo AI. It was part of the Topaz suite. They've combined all of those things. Topaz denoise and Topaz sharpen, and it's this thing called Topaz AI. I think it's about $150. But it does a fabulous job. They sent this photograph to Topaz AI and it did two things. It automatically selected the background and applied a Gaussian blur. That got rid of all the noise. And then it sharpened the bird. I didn't have to do anything. That was done in 2 minutes. So All good wildlife photographers these days are using this technique. Many of your colleagues will be submitting photos in the competition that don't have noise in the background anymore and very sharp. So be aware of the technology and use, I recommend you get Photoshop AI. Susan.
Because you're speaking about a photo compensation, so you find that using auto ISO when you're kind of wandering around and having to pick different, aim at different things, you're finding that that's the best?
That's a very good.
Limit on it as well?
Thank you. That's a very good question, Susan. The question is, when you're in difficult situations, are you best off using auto ISO and then just letting the other, the exposure and the shutter speed and letting the camera? And the answer was, when I was shooting a digital SLR with a mirror, that is how I would do it.
Yeah.
I would, when it was challenging, I would put it in auto ISO and I would simply shoot an aperture priority. I didn't always go to manual. I rarely went to manual. For reasons that I cannot quite explain, I have found that with a Canon mirrorless camera, that when you go to auto ISO, it starts doing some funky things. And it's giving me ISOs that are just not correct. And I don't know why. Okay, thank you. That's the second person. So what has happened, for what I do now with the mirrorless camera is I shoot in manual, because now I can control all three things. So I'm not sure if that's a unique feature to Canon, but the computer is making some decisions, and I found that it was making the wrong decisions on ISO. So the answer to your question is yes and no. I would use auto ISO when I was using a mirrored camera, and I'm finding that at the moment I'm now shooting in manual because I don't trust the auto ISO. So I recommend, and you'll only see this when you're in a canopy, when you're in shade, and then it will. Derek, did you have a question? Okay. All righty. So thank you very much. That's a really great question, and I had to learn this the hard way. Okay, so now comes the question. I've shared with you a lot of processing ways we can improve our photos, but here's the question. What if I over-process a photograph and submit it into competition? Now, I don't know about you, but it could be 6 months, a year between the time I process a photo and come back to it, and by the time people may ask for photos in this area, I could look at a photo and go, oh yeah, I remember that photograph, and put it in, and according to some of the rules, I might be cheating. And that's the last thing we would want to do. So how do I keep myself honest? So the first thing is to know the rules of the competition and know that all competitions aren't the same, and also that all categories aren't the same. So some of the things I've showed you tonight are perfectly allowed in some categories, and some of them weren't. So the way I have solved the problem is I develop a unique naming system for highly processed photos. What do I mean by that? So most of you are familiar with the fact that out of your camera will come a name that might be, say, something like image_1234. That's a common name. It's highly recommended, by the way, that you change the name of the photograph when you bring it into your computer, and do not leave it with the name assigned by the camera. And why is that? Well, it used to be the case all the time. I'm not sure if all cameras do it, but it used to be the case that cameras would reset the numbers once you got to 10,000. And so if you took 10,000 images, it will come back and start giving the same numbers again. And you could end up with two completely different photographs having the same number. And if you ever went into your computer and a program said, oh, we have duplicate photos here, would you like me to clean them up? And you'd say, oh yeah, sure, I'd like to get rid of these. Well, they will be cleaning them up by name, not by, and so you could easily lose your very valuable photos. So it is a good thing to have a naming system that you are happy with. In my case, I'm going to show you the naming system that I use. It's not necessarily the best. You may have a better one, but I use something that looks like this. It starts with the year and the month, 2023-04. This one says St. Augustine Alligator Farm, and then there's simply a number. So the advantage, if I see this naming system, I know I shot it in 23, I know I shot it in April, and the subject was, in this case, St. Augustine. The advantage of putting the year and then the date first in the front of your photograph is if you put it in a folder and then sort them, zip, they'll all sort down. So if you have a folder that has alligators, or if you have a folder that has spoonbills, they will all order in the correct year and month that you took them, and it makes it very much easier to find. So what does that have to do with keeping myself honest? Well, now that we have a unique naming system, if I have done extensive things like cloning, I stick an X at the end of the name. And that tells me you did a lot of work with this. You probably don't want to put this into a competition. And so that's how I solve the problem, because it could be months, it could be a year before you come back to a particular photograph and choose it. And by the way, just let me comment, in general, judges are not going to call you up and say, did you? No, they're not going to do that. But if they suspect that there's too much cloning, and we saw this recently at an F3C thing, the judges will just downgrade the score on your thing and move on. And there's one exception to that. If you submit to a national competition, if you submit to the BBC or to National Audubon and you're a winner, they will ask you to send in the original raw file. So it would be a bit embarrassing if we had to send in the original raw file and it didn't really look like what we sent in. So do bear in mind that major competitions might want to see the original raw file. Okay, so coming down here, quickly, we're going to go to leading lines. Here's an example of a leading line. This obviously is Monument Valley. This is a famous place, mile marker 13. You step out in the middle of the road, you take your life in your hands, you photograph here, and you try to get off the road before you become roadkill. By the way, Diana Halstead, about 2 months ago, posted a really gorgeous photo, even better than this, and she did a terrific job. So this is an iconic shot. But there's an example of a leading line. The best leading lines lead the viewer into the picture. And here's another wonderful example of leading lines, gorgeous, and the leading lines here keep us in the picture. Here's another wonderful leading line here. I think this is Derek's shot. Works very, very well. And this is a shot by Jack Greeder from last year. And you see that the eye starts here and goes all the way down. Wonderful leading lines. And this is a photograph by Susan. This is a fabulous, fabulous photograph. This is one of the photos that was on the cusp of winning. And I hope Susan has put this into another competition, because I think this is a winning photograph. And it has gorgeous leading lines. So here's an example of a leading line taken at the St. Augustine Alligator Farm. Clearly the spoonbill has landed and is about to exit left or right, depending. He's clearly going to climb up the thing. And so that's a nice, interesting leading line. However, leading lines that lead out of the picture can be problematic because some judges don't like that, and they will tell you the eye is gone out of the picture and you want to keep the eye in the picture. 10 minutes, thank you, we're good, thank you. So in this particular case, it tells a story of where he's going to go, but some judges might say, no, so be careful about where your leading lines go. Okay, fortunately, the last section is just pleasing color. You should all be familiar with the color wheel. This is just taken off the internet. You can type in color wheel. And the most important thing to know is something called the colors or complementary colors. Colors on the opposite sides complement each other. So we have red and cyan, green and magenta. It's really a good thing to know what that is and why they work and complement each other. So there's a quick test here. Apart from green, what are the two predominant colors? First of all, this side. What? This side, what's the first color? Blue. This side? Orange. This side? This side? Okay, we have Gator fans. And if you look, you will notice that orange and blue are complementary colors. Now, this is a lovely tool called the color on the Adobe website that shows the color wheel. If you pick a color like this, it will immediately pick an opposing color or a complementary color. And you can move this thing around and it will give you the complementary colors here. It's a really terrific interactive tool. And if you want to decrease the intensity, the saturation, you just simply move it in here. So this is a great way and a great tool on the Adobe website. There's complementary colors, but there's another thing called analogous colors. And that's where colors are sitting beside each other on the color wheel. And you might say, would we ever run into a situation where we have analogous colors? Well, here's this wonderful shot last year from Anita, and those are all analogous colors. That's why that works so beautifully. I'm going to share with you, this last one's on analogous colors, and I've moved the color point in here so it's not so saturated and we're getting these more muted colors here. And I'm going to share with you two wonderful photographs, both taken that sadly did not win, only because there were not enough. And sadly, both are from the same photographer. And I would like you to see the fabulous work and some great examples of color. And I hope Nancy will forgive me, because this is an amazing, amazing photograph. And there you can see how those analogous colors work so beautifully. I asked Nancy about this photograph a month ago, and she told me it took 5 hours to get right. Wow. It's a fabulous, fabulous. And it's one of those photographs that has really stayed with me. The second photograph that stayed with me in this last year and was easy to select for this was also by Nancy, and it's this wonderful shot here. Now, I am hoping that Nancy has sold the rights of this shot to Hallmark cards, because nothing, and made a shitpot load of money from the licensing, because I think that this would sell a whole lot of cards, don't you think? Yeah. And wouldn't it be the sweetest revenge to get lots of money and prove the judge was wrong? But I share this with you because not all great photos win, simply because there's a limited number. And we had some fabulous shots last year. And Not winning doesn't mean that you didn't take a great photograph. Your photographs can inspire other people, as these two photographs have inspired me. So please do submit your photos. Try something different. Take a risk, and don't throw them all into the general category. And the great thing is you learn a lot and have fun. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sean.
All righty, thank you.
All right, that concludes tonight's meeting, and we'll see a bunch of you at Milano's for the meeting.